There's a new kind of war shaping up in the Middle East, and it's taking to the skies. We're going to learn more about it on today's episode of The Hot Zone.
This is The Hot Zone. Engaging with the news in a whole new way, international war correspondent Chuck Holton brings insight into areas of crisis and lets you help those affected.
Hey folks, now many of you know I'm a big drone enthusiast. I've owned those things for years, and the kind of footage you can get with these amazing flying cameras is really unlike anything else out there. I mean, just this week I was taking pictures of some of the incredible scenery around this place where I live, and it's just amazing. I mean, I'm showing it to you here. This is just part of the valley here, the mountains around El Valle, and there was some people camping up on top of the mountain. I got some great shots of that. There's some incredible waterfalls that I can fly to from my house, and just incredible stuff that you can't get any other way. And drones are really changing industry. They're going to be delivering things with them before long. They're doing inspections with them, all sorts of things. So they're really an incredible improvement to our lives in many, many ways. But whenever some new technology takes the world by storm, you can be sure that bad guys out there are going to try to find a way to use it for nefarious purposes. That's just all there is to it. We're going to take a deep dive into that subject today. But before we get to that, I just want to point out one small thing that isn't worth a whole podcast, but it's certainly interesting. There were violent clashes in Tapachula, Mexico a couple days ago. You might remember when I was down there back in November of last year. African migrants have been thwarted in their attempts to keep traveling north to the United States. Mexican national police forces barred their way because Mexico's trying to make a show of reducing the numbers entering into the U.S. from Mexico, since Donald Trump threatened sanctions on Mexico that would cost that country billions of dollars. But these migrants who we've been following all the way from Africa over to Ecuador and then up through Central America, across the Darien Gap, they're really put out. They're demanding not just food and water, but money and transportation to get to the United States. This is just the kind of people we want in our country, right? Well, as I've said before, many of these men, and they're almost all military-age males, they hail from countries that are essentially failed states. And that means they don't really know how to handle being in a place that's governed by the rule of law. And so when confronted with something like this, their first response is to get violent. Now, I've met a lot of these migrants, and look, you have to empathize with their desire for a better life. And I really think that people ought to be able to travel to and live wherever they want. But the sense of entitlement many of these guys display is really off-putting, I have to be honest. They've have expectations that they're going to be able to travel from their countries halfway across the globe, and that they'll be fed and sheltered and given free transportation and allowed into these countries illegally just by virtue of the fact that they call themselves immigrants. They've traveled without papers, many of them receiving money from friends and relatives who are already in the United States, taking advantage of generous social welfare programs, and they expect to be allowed in because, well, so many before them were allowed in, so why not? But times are changing, and all the countries along the route are feeling the effects of being part of this pipeline. I would expect that we'll see even more of this violence, and many of these guys are going to figure out pretty soon that they're not going to make it to the United States, and they're now stuck in limbo in a country where they never intended to live. All right, let's lighten things up a little bit. In Spain, the streets were running red this week, but not from blood. There's a little-known tomato festival where thousands crowd the streets and pelt each other with fruits or vegetables, whatever they are. Before long, there was about 6 inches of tomato sauce that I'm sure had a little zing to it. It probably tasted like bare Spanish feet. And everyone had a really good time wrestling and swimming around in the muck.
It was amazing. It was the best day of our life. Like, it was so much fun. I don't know. There's so many trucks came. We thought there wouldn't be very many tomatoes, but there were so many. You're soaked in them. We just came from the river, so we're cleaned off now.
Come here, feel this. It's an experience, and it was awesome. Yo-ho!
So whatever makes you happy. Now, Let's look at this drone war that's happening in the Middle East. We saw it starting back a few years ago when ISIS started using off-the-shelf drones to drop hand grenades on unsuspected Iraqi troops in the fight against Mosul. Now, they used them for reconnaissance also to vector in car bombs with very lethal effects. The captured video of this stuff is really chilling. So because these jackasses did that, my drone now won't even take off anymore anywhere inside Iraq or Syria or Afghanistan, and the list of places you can't fly grows almost every day. So thanks a lot, ISIS. The Houthi rebels in Yemen have been using drones for some time to hit targets inside the borders of their archenemy, Saudi Arabia, but now it's getting really serious.
First of all, there's the unknowable threat of Syria. I mean, there we're down to day-to-day. It's chaos now with the Americans and Russians doing their business. I mean, this isn't a prediction, but America and Russia are just a few steps away from a shooting war. Completely change the situation. Turkey, unknown. And then if you look into Syria, you've got utter chaos. I mean, so a prediction that goes more than a few hours I think is pointless. Directed threat is Iran. Iran is Iran. Iran is Hezbollah. They've made it very clear. They just had a parade with their new missiles, destroy Tel Aviv. To a certain extent, I like the Iranians. I like honest murderers. They're upfront. They tell me exactly what they have in mind, but they're the threat. I think a Hezbollah attack is a matter of time. It's a matter of when, not if. I can see a number of different scenarios, some of them directed down Iran for its reasons, starting something. I can see local reasons, Hezbollah having political issues in Lebanon and needing to stir something up. And I can see inadvertent reasons. It's what I call the nursery school scenario. A rocket is fired for whatever reason, it hits the nursery school. And then the spiral just takes off. So any one of a number of reasons that could do it. We were very close to a war a couple of years ago, and that might be the incident you were referring to. We took out the Hezbollah leader in Syria, Jihad Murnia, Imad Murnia's son, by the way. Imad Murnia was the guy behind the Marine barracks bombing. We took him out a few years ago. And we killed an Iranian general. They, a few months later, fired missiles, anti-tank missiles, at some of our vehicles on more of the Lebanese side, but still, they did it. They killed an officer and a soldier. And that came very close to that spiral.
This week, Israel says they thwarted a killer drone attack by Palestinian terrorists trained by Iran. Then, in one night, Israel sent killer drones into some Hezbollah outposts in Beirut that were making propellant for drones and rockets that were destined to attack back in Israel. And the same night, Israeli Air Force bombed targets near Damascus, Syria, which it says were drone launching bases that Iran was planning to use against them. Last week also, some ammunition dumps in Iraq mysteriously went up in flames, and they were sites that belonged to Iranian-backed militias that had been operating in Iraq for years. Nobody has claimed responsibility for those attacks, but everybody's pretty sure they were carried out by Israeli drones. Now, Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, got up and made an impassioned speech. When has he ever not made an impassioned speech about these attacks on Beirut? He said, quote, "If we remain silent on this breach, it'll create a very dangerous road for Lebanon, where every couple of days or 3 days, an explosive drone or suicide drone will target a certain building, farm, field, mosque, or compound, and no one knows where it comes from," repeating of what is going on in Iraq right now. Now, I don't know what he means by suicide drones. That sort of is a contradiction in terms, but whatever. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, shot back at him and said, look, while we're building our future, there's someone who wants to destroy everything that we're building and return us to a dark past. He says, I heard Nasrallah's remarks, and I suggest that Nasrallah just relax. He knows very well that the state of Israel knows how to defend itself and how to pay back its enemies. I want to tell him and the Lebanese state, which is sheltering this organization that aspires to destroy us. And I also say this to Qasem Soleimani, who's the general in charge of some of these provisional military units run by Iran in Iraq. He says, quote, be careful with your words and even more careful with your actions. So to say tensions are high is an understatement. And the UN is asking everyone just take a breather and chill out a little bit before things really get out of hand.
The UN calls on the parties to exercise maximum restraint, both in action and in rhetoric. Over the last few days, we have seen in the broader Middle East reports of drone attacks, missile attacks, and airstrikes all over the region, Israel and Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, as well as Saudi Arabia, and that all since Friday. I think all of these reports are of concern to us. We're continuing to follow the situation closely. And I think as the Secretary General has said and consistently maintained, the Middle East region cannot afford any additional turmoil.
So Jonathan Spire, Director of Middle East Center for Reporting and Analysis, he agrees with the UN's sentiment and says this could get hot in a hurry.
I think it's very worrying, actually, from an Israeli point of view. I would think, and I think what we're hearing also in Hebrew language media, is that the Israeli political and security establishment is deeply concerned by this, because after all, in light of the events of recent days, you know, when Israeli-Iranian tensions are perhaps at the highest that they've been, you know, certainly for the last couple of years, you know, with the possibility of the real possibility of kinetic action between the sides on the agenda. At that moment, for Israel to get the sense that the United States is not necessarily in any way on board for any of that, and in fact is looking for diplomatic windows of opportunity, there's a sense in which undoubtedly, yes, the sphere of activity has now broadened from Syria itself, eastwards into Iraq, westwards into Lebanon. It's very hard for me to see that narrowing once again. I think that field of operations will continue at a similar tempo. Now, how things could intensify is, of course, that Hezbollah, Lebanese Hezbollah that is, which lost, after all, at least 2 operatives in the recent bombing in Syria, in southwestern Syria, is looking for revenge. Very possibly Iran and its militias are looking for revenge also for the events in Iraq. Now, up until now, their attempts at revenge have been unsuccessful. Should such an attempt be successful and result in a considerable loss of Israeli life, whether military or civilian, then you might see an intensification of Israel's subsequent response. And then there's a real possibility, I would say, as we've seen in the past in this arena, of an escalation towards a much broader conflict.
John Gambrill, news director for the Gulf and Iran at the Associated Press, says this is part of a growing trend. Listen to this, it's very interesting.
The Middle East is in the middle of what appears to be a growing drone war. That's as we've seen increased tensions between Iran and the United States over Iran's nuclear deal with world powers. About a year ago, President Donald Trump withdrew America unilaterally from the nuclear deal. Immediately afterwards, Iran tried diplomacy and tried to work with European partners, but over time they were unable to find a way to sell their crude oil on the global market. We started to see an increase in drone activity, starting first with the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen. They began launching further and further drone strikes into Saudi Arabia. There are 2 drone strikes in particular that drew a lot of attention. One targeted Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline, which is crucial for it to take oil from its eastern fields to the Red Sea in the west. There was also an attack deep inside Saudi Arabia's empty quarter. That's a vast sea of desert that's in Saudi Arabia. Now, after that, we saw that Israel began launching its own strikes. Now, most recently, it launched some strikes in Syria. Israel says these strikes targeted Iranian so-called killer drones. These are drones that have bombs on them that can be used to target targets. They can either explode above the target or they can collide with the target and explode. Now, these are the same sort of drones that the Houthis had been using in Yemen. That's why UN experts and the West believe that these drones that the Houthis have were either given to them by Iran or the Iranians helped build them. Now, Israel says it targeted these drones, or these supposed drone stockpiles, because an attack was imminent from Iran. Now, Iran has denied that it had planned any sort of attack and had denied that any of its troops or anyone allied to Iran had been injured in these recent strikes. Now, overnight, we saw one drone crash, an Israeli drone crash in Beirut, and we saw another Israeli drone explode in midair. Now, there hasn't really been an explanation from Israel about what's happened there, but it just goes to show that as tensions between Iran and the U.S. rise, that people are increasingly turning to drones for this kind of warfare. And even though they're drones and they're pilotless, they can spark further tensions in the Middle East.
So you can expect to see drones being used more and more by both sides, and the market for drone countermeasures is definitely going to be a hot growth item in the years ahead. And it won't surprise me if at some point I'm not going to be able to fly my drone anywhere but my own backyard. And that's a real shame, because there are a lot of really beautiful places out there that you could get footage of. All right, that's all I've got for today's podcast, folks. Have a great weekend. I'll see you back here on Monday. I'm Chuck Holton, and this has been The Hot Zone.
The Hot Zone is produced by Amy Holton and Livefire Media. Copyright 2019.